Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our sponsors, the Grand Conseil de Vin de Bordeaux and the National Council of the Commandery de Bordeaux of the United States, we are pleased to present a debate concerning an issue that has been on all of our minds the last couple of days, if not longer. Why, in a particular area of the right bank, we have two artisanal chateaus are not receiving the traction they should receive in the U.S. So we're looking for why the Petit Chateau, artisanal chateaus, are not receiving the traction they should in the U.S. Our debaters today are Chuck Horn, a stellar advocate and orator from the West Coast, focusing on structural issues in France, and Jim Finkel, the sotto voce contender from the East Coast, who will focus on the U.S. consumer. To moderate this grape debate is our fearless leader, Eric Vogt, our own version of William F. Buckley, Jr., a man who could lead a debate when debating was an art form and not mudsling as it is today. Eric, as an insightful and demanding questioner in the great New England tradition. Gentlemen, let's keep it clean. That's what. And without further ado, Eric Vogt.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all today. And this is a question that's been on my mind for several years. And I think it's topical for us as commandeurs, and it's topical clearly for the people who are the winemakers in Bourg and Blaye. Today's debate will last 30 minutes. After an introductory overview of the Blaye and Bourg areas presented by the debaters to give you some context, each debater will make introductory statements about their respective side of the issue. And this is a not affirmative negative debate. This is two different perspectives on the development of the market for Bourg and Blaye. I will then ask them a few questions and encourage the debaters to question each other about the finer points of their arguments and the support therefore. Evidence, please, gentlemen. Finally, I will attempt to bring the debaters together as to whether they, in fact, can find common ground on what constructive suggestions they might make.
Chuck's going to talk a little bit about, just to remind us, where are we talking about?
So it's the area, it has waterfront on the estuary, on the Gironde, and on the Dordogne, just right at the corner across from the city of Bordeaux. It's sort of northeast from the city of Bordeaux. You've got Bourg, and I, as an American, pronounce it Bourg with a G. Hubert Board yesterday pronounced it Bourg, no G. So Bourg and Blaye, B-L like E-Y-E, Blaye, not Blaye. Bourg and Blaye, and you can see Blaye is much larger. Bourg is much smaller. That reflects their production of wines. The quality is different over the years. You've got a 9%, we start with a 9% share of production compared to everything from Bordeaux. Look how much wine they produce. It's up there with Saint-Emilion, with other Côte de Bordeaux, and it's not that far below the Medoc and Haute-Medoc. It's a tremendous amount of wine.
There's a lot of history of this area as well, and I won't try to drag you all through it. The Citadel, designed by Vauban. We'll see some pictures of it. But interestingly, just as we heard yesterday about the Battle of Castillon, it was a lot about the range of artillery at the time. Wasn't, strong enough to prevent ships from passing. Therefore, Vauban designed two other forts in the area that could deal with defense of the whole area. Very, very scenic, beautiful little towns, which don't get as much tourist attraction as they probably deserve.
There's several hundred vineyards around the towns of Blaye and Bourg, though it can be difficult to discern exactly how many. In 1936, 3 AOCs were created for this region: Blaye AOC, Côte de Blaye AOC, and Premier Côte de Blaye AOC. These all covered the same geographical area, with Premier Côte de Blaye including the most prestigious properties. These AOCs were revised in the 1990s, and Blaye AOC was used for the top reds while still being used for some simple dry whites. Then in 2007, the AOCs were revised again. Blaye AOC is now exclusively red, and Côte de Blaye AOC is exclusively white.
And for Bourg, it's much smaller in geographic area, but you see it still has about 3,900 hectares under vine. It varies in statistics I've seen from 32 to 3,500 to 3,900, but it's smaller and again a little bit better organized for international visitors, with 157 named wineries.
So a little bit on the cépage and terroir of Blaye. The annual production of Blaye is 2.25, is that million?
Million, yes.
Million cases, 90% red, 10% white. The area is hillier than the Medoc. We just heard that live from one of our presenters. The soil is mostly clay over limestone, very fertile soil that must be cultivated carefully to keep yields under control. The area under vines is around 7,000 hectares.
Oh, no, it's actually 5,200. I got that wrong.
Okay, it's actually 5,200 hectares. The research on this is difficult to do, and thanks to Jim for pinning this down.
Now, Bourg, as I mentioned, some people call it the hidden gem, between 3,200 and 3,900 hectares, depending on the count. Merlot dominant, Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc to add complexity and structure, very little bit of Malbec, and a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc. White is based, there's more white wine based that's produced up in Blaye than in Bourg. Now, onto the debate. Eric.
The basic debate here is a question about why, in general, I will claim, the wines of Bourg and Blaye are underappreciated.
Yeah,
Well, I believe the problem, and there's another side to this, there's a consumer side, but the problem is structural. It's at the source. And given the competition with other wines, the structure of what's going on in Bourg and Blaye is part of the answer. Jim will have the opposition to this, but part of the answer is found in the high degree of fragmentation among the producers in Bourg and Blaye. They are effectively too small to have the resources to compete for recognition in a market of so many wines. Another issue is the Bourg and Blaye wines are mostly sold within France. In general, French wines are only 4% of the US market. They're lagging to US domestic 75%, Italian 9%, and Australian 4% plus. French wines have the highest, given that French wines have the highest average retail price by $13. So it's, there's a challenge there at the source and the structure of what's going on with Bourg and Blaye. Another issue is to the extent they are exported, the distribution is effectuated outside the Place de Bordeaux. It's outside the negotiant system, being exported by merchants who are conflicted about promoting one brand over another, given their overall portfolios. And finally, there is no meaningful professional association support to create the kind of brand equity for these wines compared with the Cru Classé.
And Chuck, I have to disagree to some extent. Now, this isn't really a disagreement about the weight of the challenge, whether I think Chuck's issues, the structural issues, have more gravity as a challenge to the progress of these wines than the consumer side here in the US. My issues are much more about the consumer here in the US. I think the problem is multiple, has multiple elements to it. The first one is that the image of Bordeaux wines for the American consumer is more one of tradition and less about artisanal winemaking. Most wine consumers in the US really exhibit their preference in wine buying, and this has been done through professional research, based on varietal. They don't do it based on terroir, so they wouldn't necessarily say, oh, I'd rather have a Côte de Bourg versus a Haut Medoc. They say, oh, I like Merlot, or I like Cab Sauvignon, or I like Zinfandel. And that's obviously a challenge when most of these wines are not unilateral varietals, they are blended wines. The third issue is the perception of quality. I think it's very hard for the consumer to say that a wine that's inexpensive is a high quality wine. It's something that the surveys, the professional surveys, have been struggling with, and it seems to be a very bifurcated situation. And I've heard this is the same thing with restaurants, that the lower priced items on the menu are not purchased as often as the higher priced items because customers think the dish might not be as good. So there's just a lot of psychology about price point.
So the rebuttal to those points is that those wine consumer points, that there's a market there, but it has to be led by what's going on at the source. What we saw yesterday with the satellite, the arc of AOCs around Saint-Emilion. We know everyone knows Saint-Emilion. It's a World Heritage Site. Almost everyone knows Pomerol. But then there's that arc of AOCs surrounding it, and we went from Fronsac to all the way down to Castillon and Côte de Franc and Lalande de Pomerol, all these others. Guess what? They didn't mention the wider arc. They didn't get to Bourg and Blaye. And so if even in this setting we don't even see them, my point is it's structural, it's in the geography, and I don't think it even gets to the consumer level as something that's a problem.
Well, but I really think there's been huge inroads in building brand equity, and that's the term that the people in the trade use. There's been brand equity built, at least I think, for subregions of Bordeaux. I think there's huge competition as the wine market has grown for importers to find wines that are affordable. And I think even if the Place de Bordeaux, the negociants, don't cover these wines, we did hear, by the way, that Chateau d'Alem, the one wine we had last night, toward the end of our tasting, at dinner and at the tasting, that is the only wine of the Petit Chateau that's covered by the negociant system, and they buy 100% of the wine. And as the fellow who represented Delem told us at dinner, the negociants never buy what they know they can't sell. So I think, again, Chuck may have a good point, but I think there's more brand equity building, more importers who are looking like the Neil Rosenthal's, the Kermit Lynch's, who are looking for artisanal winemakers, and they're doing a better job than Chuck might think in terms of that.
Well, we've heard the two positions. We've heard some rebuttal. I wonder, in the process of going through this debate, which is, when you think about it, it's a really interesting debate, because it's basically saying for small hectare producers who don't have access to the Place, how do you go to market, and what is it that needs to change for a more brilliant future and raise your price point in the market above $5.33? But you had a chance to talk about this. What ideas have come to mind to you as to how to approach this situation?
On the consumer side here in the U.S., we have a large alcohol drinking consumer base.
It's still predominantly a beer market. There's a fast-growing RTD segment, ready-to-drink market. But 50% of the market is purchases of $5 to $10.
We're up against beer being the predominant U.S. Alcohol consumption item, or basically prepackaged cocktails.
That is where the market's going. This ready-to-drink cocktail is such a big item, and as we see with the can, Emmanuel, what a fabulous idea, and what great packaging, what great labeling, by the way.
Chuck's point, essentially, I have to concede, is that if they don't start developing these kind of new marketing trends in following our consumer demand, they're dead out of the, right out of the water, right at the outset. Now you also see, it's fascinating, the volumes of wine at the price points. The largest segment is wine that sells from $5 to $10, and it declines pretty fast after $20. And our wines are still in the $20 to $25 range, so they're still bumping up against a limited market. And that's the next question, is should these winemakers be pushing for higher volumes and lower price points?
So, Jim, I'm going to pull you guys off the PowerPoint. I'd like to go to everyone in the room, just to get a show of hands as to whether you think, raise a hand if you think the primary issue is structural for these wines in Bordeaux. Okay, we got about 10, 12. And raise your hand if you think the issue is consumer marketing, better execution. Okay, so despite your eloquence, Jim's people seem to be leading the perspective, but you've also had some time to think about the metaphor or examples of people who broke through to the market effectively, and what might we learn from that?
Well, one experience that Jim and I have had, and I think many people in this room have had, is years ago, and I tried to do some research on it. You can't find it; it doesn't exist in social media. Something called Les Cinq, French for the Five, and it was a group of. It focused on all of Bordeaux, if you will. It was 5 disparate geographic regions. It was Alfred Tesseron from Pauillac, Patrick Marteau from Saint-Julien, Stefan van Nijperg from Saint-Emilion, Nicolas de Bijencourt from Gazin up in Pomerol, and help me,
Smith-on-Lafitte.
Smith-on-Lafitte. So the 5 of them made a commitment, and it was multi-year. It was like 4 or 5 years where they got together, they came over, and they spent time at a table with us in cities around the country, and we got to know them, and then we got to know them the next year, and the next year, and then we went to visit them, and they came to visit us again. And these have become lifelong relationships, and when they move on, it's with their families. The relationship continues. And it opened up the broad geography of Bordeaux to so many of us. And now our constructive suggestion to get around the structural change is to find maybe 2 very engaging, charismatic, if you will, winemakers or owners in Bourg and 2 in Blaye. Keep the investment simple, just 4 people. Send them over for a few weeks. Have them make a personal commitment that they will do this year after year and get to know us. And by us, I don't mean just the commandery. That when they come to a city, set up a commercial tasting, small, intimate, private, and have what we did in San Francisco is we had 5 tables, 1 Pauillac, one Saint-Emilion with labels on them, and you would go to a table and you would sit with the person from that area and get to know their wines and their area, and they all share and talk about their neighbors and the other vineyards and the other chateaus. And if Bourg and Blaye can put something like that together, if they can find 4 people that would commit to that, we think it would make a tremendous contribution to the marketing of Bourg and Blaye and raise the profile.
But I think it's still, and that's again at the source. That's a structural issue that Chuck is absolutely correct to, I think, focus on. But on the demand side, here in the US, one of the things that we've seen through studies is 2 things we've seen. One is labeling is dramatically important. It really affects consumer behavior. Prestige and classic labels do much better. Label preferences among women and men are quite different. And we've also found out that 57% of wine buyers in the U.S. are now female, and that basically half of the wine buyers in the U.S. are age 55 and over and earning up $80,000 or more. And I think these winemakers or the marketers need to focus on those demographics. We need to have more women winemakers with more easy to follow labels, more elegant labels. I thought the Dauphine last night was probably the most elegant and approachable label. And I think those are other constructive suggestions we're sending back to the Bourg and Blaye producers.
So I think what's really interesting here is the notion that Le Cinq was effective 15 to 18 years ago, and you're calling for Les Quatre,
Yes.
4 winemakers. I don't know if they're all female winemakers out of Bourg and Blaye, but would it make sense for us to actually become proactive and help organize and sponsor the growth of Les Quatre from Bourg and Blaye?
Absolutely. It would be easy to do, it would be fun to do.
Great. To be continued. Thank you for the great debate.
Thank you.
I was hurting.